Victor Kane pressed his boot against the throat of a dying informant and smiled. Not because he enjoyed it, because the man had just confirmed what he suspected for weeks. Someone was out there. Someone had been systematically destroying his operations without ever firing a visible shot, without leaving a single trace. "Tell me her name," Victor whispered. The informant couldn't answer anymore. Victor stood up, straightened his jacket, and made a phone call. "Find the ghost," he said. "Find her before she finds us." If you love stories about invisible warriors and unsung heroes, subscribe right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The cold in Montana in late October doesn't announce itself politely. It doesn't come with wind or warning signs or gradual drops in temperature that give your body time to adjust. It arrives all at once like a decision already made, and by the time you realize how deep it's gotten into your bones, you've already stopped shivering, which is the part that should scare you most. Because when you stop shivering, your body has given up trying to fight it. Maya Carter had stopped shivering years ago, not from the cold, from everything else. She had been lying in the same position for 11 hours on a ridge approximately 900 meters above the valley floor. Her body pressed flat against granite that had absorbed the nighttime temperature and held it like a grudge. Her gear was matte black and hand-modified to eliminate any surface that might catch light. Her breathing was slow and measured 4 counts in 6 counts out, the kind of rhythm that takes years to teach the body and even longer to make automatic. Below her, the terrain opened into a long forested corridor that ran roughly northeast toward the border, and somewhere inside that corridor, 11 Navy SEALs were trying to stay alive. She had found them on day 2 of their operation. That wasn't supposed to happen. Her mission parameters said observe and protect without engagement. They said remain undetected at all costs. They said that under no circumstances was she to make direct contact with the unit she was assigned to shadow. But nobody had told her what to do when she realized the unit didn't know they were already surrounded. That had been 9 days ago. In those 9 days, Maya had done things that would never appear in any official after-action report. She had relocated a pressure-sensitive IED buried in the SEAL team's intended path by moving it 3 centimeters to the left so that the trigger wire rested against a rock instead of the ground, making it impossible to detonate. She had found a 4-man enemy observation post on a hillside overlooking the team's temporary camp and had spent 40 minutes crawling through underbrush to reach it. Then another 20 minutes waiting for the exact moment when the rotation of sentries created a 12-second window, and in that 12 seconds, she had done what needed to be done and vanished before any of them had time to make a sound. She had done these things alone, without a partner, without backup, without anyone in the world knowing exactly where she was or what she was doing. This was not unusual for Maya Carter. This was Tuesday. She pressed her eye to the spotting scope and watched the SEAL platoon settle into their night position below. 11 men, 11 different ways of moving, 11 different patterns she had memorized completely in the first 48 hours. Sergeant Marcus Webb always set up on the left flank and always checked his rifle 3 times before he stopped moving. Lieutenant David Park had a habit of pausing for exactly 2 seconds before he changed direction, a micro-hesitation that an enemy trained to watch for it could exploit. The team medic, a compact and quietly intense young man named Torres, always positioned himself within 5 meters of the team leader, which meant protecting the team leader also protected the medic, which was an efficiency Maya appreciated. And Captain Ryan Mitchell, she had spent more time studying Ryan Mitchell than anyone else on the team. Not because he was the commander, though that was part of it. Not because he was the most tactically significant member of the unit, though that was also true. But because Ryan Mitchell was the kind of man who noticed things. Most soldiers, when operating under sustained stress, contracted their awareness inward. They focused on the immediate, the next step, the next breath, the next enemy position. It was a survival mechanism, and it was the right response in most tactical situations. And Maya didn't hold it against any of them. But Ryan Mitchell did the opposite. He expanded. In the 2 days after the IED had failed to detonate, when his team had discussed it among themselves and chalked it up to a manufacturing defect, Ryan had stood at the edge of their camp and looked up at the ridgelines. Not quickly, not in a scanning tactical way, but slowly, with the kind of attention that suggested he was not looking for something he expected to find, but listening for something he couldn't name. Maya had watched him do this and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was close, not to her position, not to any specific answer, but to the question itself, and that was dangerous. She filed it away and kept watching. On the morning of day 9, the operation was supposed to be winding down. The SEAL team had completed their reconnaissance objectives and the extraction window was set for 36 hours out. In intelligence terms, this was the most dangerous phase of any mission. Not the infiltration, not the active reconnaissance. The extraction. Because that was when the enemy knew you were leaving and they had nothing left to lose by coming for you. What nobody in the operational command chain had accounted for was Victor Kane. Maya didn't know his name yet at this point. She knew him only as an anomaly in the enemy's tactical behavior. She had been tracking the extremist network for long enough to understand their patterns, and their patterns had changed 3 days ago in a way that made the back of her neck go tight. Enemy patrols that had been predictable in their routes and timing had become irregular. Observation posts that had followed a consistent rotation schedule had gone silent without being replaced. And 2 nights ago, a 4-man unit that she had been tracking had simply stopped moving and waited, which was not something this particular network did. They moved. They were always moving. Sitting still was not in their tactical vocabulary. Sitting still meant someone had told them to sit still. Someone who understood the value of patience. Someone who was waiting for something specific. Maya had shifted from observation mode to threat assessment mode and spent the next 18 hours trying to identify the new variable. She found the first piece of evidence at 0340 hours on day 8 in the form of a satellite phone call she intercepted and partially decoded. The conversation was brief and partially encrypted, but the portion she could read contained 3 words that she wrote down in the small field notebook she carried in her left breast pocket. The 3 words were "find the absence." She stared at those words for a long time. Most surveillance operations look for presence, for movement, for heat signatures or sound signatures or physical evidence of human activity. They looked for what was there, find the absence. That meant someone was looking for what wasn't there, for the gap in the enemy's own surveillance data, for the pattern of failures that shouldn't have happened but did, for the shape of something that could only be explained by an invisible hand. Someone was looking for her, not for a person specifically. They didn't know she was a person yet. They knew only that something was protecting the SEAL team, and they were trying to find it by studying what it had removed from the battlefield. Maya sat with that realization for a moment. Then she picked up her spotting scope and went back to work. Because the mission didn't stop because someone was hunting her. The mission was the mission, but she began to move differently after that. She changed her observation positions more frequently, never staying in one place longer than 2 hours, even when the tactical situation argued for staying longer. She altered the timing and direction of her movements to eliminate any pattern that might be detectable from the outside. She stopped using certain types of equipment that had specific electromagnetic signatures and switched to purely optical tools that left no electronic footprint. And she watched the ridge lines above her the same way Ryan Mitchell watched the ridge lines below, looking for the absence. On the afternoon of day 9, she found it. She was repositioning along a secondary ridge when she noticed that a large bird had stopped calling in the tree line to her east. Not unusual on its own, birds stopped calling when something moved near them. But she had been moving north, not east, and there was no reason for her movement to have disturbed anything in the eastern tree line. She stopped. She stayed completely still for 4 minutes. The bird did not start calling again. Maya changed direction and spent the next hour working her way slowly toward the eastern tree line from the opposite side, approaching from an angle that kept her in dead ground relative to any observation post that might be positioned inside the trees. She found the footprints at the base of a large Douglas fir. They were good footprints. Professional. The person who had made them was skilled at moving in wilderness terrain, and they had done a proper job of minimizing their imprint. But they had made one mistake. They had approached the tree from the uphill side, which meant their weight had been loaded onto their toes, and the toe impression in the soft earth was just slightly deeper than ideal. Amateur mistake. The kind you made when you were very good but not quite perfect. Maya studied the footprints for exactly 90 seconds. Then she backed away the way she had come and spent the next 2 hours repositioning herself to a location she had not used before and had not planned to use. a location she had identified on day one as a last resort. She was being hunted. The ghost had been found by someone who could see the shape of her absence, and she had 36 hours to keep 11 men alive before they could get out of this valley. She opened her field notebook and wrote a single line: "He thinks like me." Then she closed the notebook and started planning. The first question was not who he was or what resources he had. The first question was always, what does he think I'm going to do next? Because if someone was hunting her by tracking her absences, then the most dangerous thing she could do was the thing that felt most natural. The instinct to protect the SEAL team by staying close to them was exactly the instinct he would expect. He would position his surveillance assets along the routes that offered the best protective overwatch of the team's position. He would create a perimeter around the thing he knew she cared about, and he would wait for her to walk into it. Maya had learned a long time ago from a man named Daniel Reeves that the greatest trap was not the one that was strongest. It was the one that felt like safety. The enemy doesn't need to know where you are, Daniel used to say. They only need to know where you're going. If they can predict your destination, they own your direction. And if they own your direction, they own you. She heard his voice clearly in those moments, precise and quiet and utterly without sentiment, the way he had always been. Daniel Reeves had never believed in unnecessary words, which meant the ones he chose carried double the weight. She had learned more from his silences than from most people's speeches. He had been dead for 4 years. She still talked to him sometimes. Not out loud, just in the way that people carry the voices of people who shape them, turning them over in their minds when the situation demands it. She asked him now, what do you do when the person hunting you thinks like you? And she heard in that internal voice that wasn't quite his and wasn't quite hers, the only answer that made sense. You stop being predictable. You stop being the person they're hunting. You become something they haven't imagined yet. Maya put her spotting scope away. She pulled out a hand-drawn map she had made of the valley on day one, covered now with 9 days of annotations in her small, precise handwriting, and she began to reconstruct the tactical situation from the perspective of someone who was hunting her rather than protecting the SEAL team. She thought about the 3 words she had intercepted. Find the absence. If she were hunting herself, where would she look? She would look at the places where the enemy had failed. Not at the failures themselves, which could have any number of explanations, but at the spatial relationship between the failures. At the corridor they implied, at the position you would have to be in to have caused all of them. She drew a circle on her map. It was a large circle, nearly a kilometer in diameter, and its center was approximately 200 meters north of the SEAL team's current position. That circle was where she had been operating for the last 4 days. If the person hunting her was as good as she thought he was, he had already drawn the same circle, which meant he had observation posts covering the most likely observation positions within it, which meant he was waiting for her to enter it. She looked at the circle for a long time. Then she drew a line from the SEAL team's current position to their extraction point 30 kilometers to the northeast. The line ran directly through the circle. Her jaw tightened. She had known the extraction route was not ideal. Too predictable, too confined by terrain, with only 3 viable corridors through the mountain range, and the enemy already aware that an extraction was coming. But 36 hours wasn't enough time to reroute the operation through channels, get the new route approved, coordinate with the extraction assets, and get the information to the SEAL team. The team was going to walk through that corridor, and the person hunting her was going to be waiting on both sides of it. She had to get ahead of them, not to protect the road. She couldn't do that alone, not against a coordinated ambush with enough firepower to pin down 11 trained fighters in confined terrain. But she could do something else. She could force the enemy to react to her. The idea was uncomfortable in the way that the best ideas often were. It required her to do the things she had spent 6 years training herself not to do. It required her to be visible, not to the SEAL team, to the enemy. Not all at once, not in a way that would get her killed, but enough, a presence. A ghost that chose to make a sound, not to fight but to pull, to draw the enemy's attention toward her and away from the corridor. She would become the threat. She would become the thing they had to chase, and she would lead them in the exact wrong direction. She lay still in her new position and breathed carefully and thought about Daniel and thought about the SEAL team and thought about the compass she always carried in her right hip pocket, the one that didn't point to any external north, but that she had carried since the day Daniel died because he had given it to her with the words, When you're lost, remember where you were going. She wasn't lost, but she was about to do something that terrified her in a way that ambushes and explosives and being shot at didn't terrify her, because those were external dangers and she had learned to live with external danger. What terrified her was being seen, not in the tactical sense, not being spotted by an enemy who would then try to kill her. She had thought about that possibility so many times it had lost its emotional charge. What terrified her was being known. 6 years of invisibility had become more than a tactical choice. It had become an identity. She existed in the spaces between other people's missions. She was the reason things didn't go wrong, which meant she was never present when things went right. She had become so completely the protector who could not be acknowledged that the thought of stepping into any light at all, even the cold, hostile light of a hunter's surveillance, felt like a kind of dissolution, like she would cease to exist the moment she was seen. She knew intellectually that this was not a reasonable thought. Daniel would have called it self-indulgent. She could hear him saying it actually in that flat, direct way of his. Being afraid of being seen is a luxury. The mission doesn't care about your identity crisis. The mission cares about the outcome. Get to work. She smiled barely. Yeah, she said very quietly to no one. I know. She began planning her first deliberate appearance. It would be small, controlled, designed to create a specific impression in the mind of whoever was watching. She needed him to believe she had made a mistake. Not a fatal mistake, just enough of a mistake that it would explain how he had detected a flicker of her. She needed him to feel the satisfaction of partial confirmation, because partial confirmation was the most effective misdirection. A man who finds exactly what he's looking for stops looking harder. A man who finds a trace of what he's looking for starts chasing it. She needed him chasing. She needed him moving. She needed him away from the corridor. There was a secondary ridge approximately 800 meters to the northwest of the extraction route. It offered good overwatch of the valley approach, and it was exactly the kind of position she would have chosen if she had been operating further north. It was, in fact, the kind of position she had used on day 3, which he might have identified from his analysis of the absence patterns. If she created a signature there, a heat source small enough to be a body, but large enough to register on thermal imaging, at a time consistent with when she might be repositioning for overwatch of the extraction route, he would do one of two things. He would send people to investigate it, which would take time and pull assets away from the corridor, or he would go himself. Either outcome served her. She checked the time, 19 hours until the extraction window opened. She started moving. The night in Montana had fully committed itself by now. No moon visible, the temperature somewhere south of 15 degrees, and Maya moved through it the way she had learned to move through all difficult conditions, which was to stop thinking about the conditions. Cold was information. You acknowledged it, you dressed for it, you planned around it, and then you let it be background noise. Same with fatigue, same with fear, same with the hollow feeling that had lived in her chest for 4 years. The one that had Daniel's shape. She covered ground quickly when she needed to, and stopped completely when the terrain required it, reading the landscape the way she had been taught to read it, not as a static environment, but as a system of interlocking threat vectors that changed with the light, in the wind, and the position of every living thing within it. At 2147 hours, she stopped on a small rocky outcropping above the secondary ridge she had identified and looked down at it. From here, she could see what she had hoped to see. 2 observation posts, well-positioned, disciplined. The operators inside them were good. They weren't moving, weren't creating light, were doing everything right. But they were watching the ridge, not the approach to it. She filed that away. She also noticed after 10 minutes of watching that there was a third position that wasn't being watched from the other 2. There always was. Dead ground. It was the eternal problem of any surveillance network. You could cover your primary avenues of approach and your secondary avenues of approach. And if you were thorough and well-resourced, you could cover your tertiary avenues as well. But the terrain itself would always create at least one approach that was shielded from every observation post simultaneously, and the only way to cover it was to be inside it, and being inside dead ground defeated the purpose of an observation post. Every net had a hole. Maya found the hole. She checked her watch. 17 hours remaining. She thought about Ryan Mitchell standing at the edge of the camp and looking up at the ridgelines. She thought about the compass in her hip pocket. She thought about what Daniel had told her very early in her training, the first time she had asked him why they didn't just tell the units they were protecting about the protection. Because knowledge changes behavior, he had said, and behavior creates signatures, and signatures get people killed. The best gift you can give someone is safety without the weight of knowing it. She had understood the logic then. She understood something different now. The best gift you can give someone is safety. Full stop. Everything else was detail. She began her approach toward the secondary ridge from the only direction that no one was watching. And 11 hours later, when the SEAL team began their move toward the extraction corridor and found every enemy position along it mysteriously abandoned, Maya was 3 ridges over, bleeding from a wound on her left forearm that she had wrapped with paracord and her last piece of field dressing, watching through her spotting scope as 11 men moved steadily toward the light. She watched until they were out of sight. Then she sat down on the cold granite and breathed for a moment. In the valley below her, where the extraction corridor met the edge of the forest, she could see from this distance a shape that might have been a person standing at the tree line and looking up at the ridges. She raised her spotting scope. It was Ryan Mitchell. He stood there for a long time, not moving, looking at the mountains that surrounded him, looking for something he couldn't name. She watched him look. He looked directly at the ridge where she was sitting. She didn't move. She didn't need to. She was too far away and too still and too well concealed to be seen. But she looked back at him, and for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, and shorter than she would have allowed herself to want, 2 people stood in the same mountain morning and shared the same silence without knowing they were sharing it. Ryan turned and rejoined his team. The helicopter came 20 minutes later. Maya watched it carry them away. Then she looked at her arm and assessed the damage and decided it was manageable. Then she picked up her spotting scope and her notebook and her pack, and she began the long walk out. She didn't know that Victor Kane was watching her through a scope of his own. She didn't know that he had been watching her walk out for the last 45 minutes. She didn't know that he had lowered his scope at the same moment she had after watching Ryan Mitchell look up at the ridges. She didn't know that he had made a notation in his own field notebook. His notation read, "She has a weakness." His notation read, "She cares about them." His notation read, "Next time use that." She walked south through the cold Montana morning, and she didn't know that the hunt had truly begun. She knew only that 11 men were alive, and that was enough for now. Victor Kane had a rule he had carried for 22 years in the intelligence world: never explain a failure with luck. Luck was the excuse of men who were afraid to admit they hadn't understood the situation completely. Luck was what you called the thing you hadn't identified yet, and the moment you stopped calling it luck and started calling it a variable, you had already begun to win. Sat alone in a forward operating base that existed on no official map, in a building that had once been a livestock storage facility and still smelled like it, with 7 field reports spread across a makeshift table in front of him. Each report documented an enemy failure, an ambush that dissolved before it launched, a weapon that malfunctioned at a statistically impossible moment, a patrol that turned south when it should have turned north and walked directly away from the unit it had been dispatched to intercept. 7 failures, 11 days. Victor read through the reports a second time, then a third. He had a habit of reading things 3 times. The first read was for information. The second read was for pattern. The third read was for what wasn't there. His deputy, a former Army intelligence officer named Garrett, who had the nervous energy of a man who drank too much coffee and the analytical mind of someone who absolutely should not knock twice and stepped inside without waiting for an answer. "The satellite imagery from the overnight is in," Garrett said. "Did it show anything?" "Nothing on the primary ridgeline, nothing on the secondary approach. Thermal came back clean." Victor nodded slowly. "How clean?" Garrett stopped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what was the range on the thermal sweep? What was the minimum signature threshold they were looking for?" Garrett checked his tablet. "Standard parameters. They set it to detect signatures above 34 degrees Celsius at range. Human body temperature is 37. Right, so anything that was? What if someone was managing their signature?" Victor said. He stood up from the table and walked to the window, which had no glass, and looked out onto a dirt yard where 3 of his contractors were running equipment checks in the cold morning air. What if someone understood that a standard thermal sweep uses a 34-degree floor and they took steps to stay below it. Wet clothing over a base layer extended contact with cold ground, controlled breathing. You can drop your detectable signature by 2 or 3 degrees if you know what you're doing, and you're willing to be uncomfortable. Garrett was quiet for a moment. That's an extremely specific thing to know. Yes, Victor said, it is. He turned back to the table. He picked up the field report from day 4 and held it next to the one from day 7. He had done this before, but this time he was looking at the spatial relationship between the documented failures differently. Not as a timeline, as a radius. Get me a topographical overlay, he said. Of what area? All of it. Every location where an enemy operation failed during the window. Overlay them on terrain. I want to see the coverage pattern. Garrett left and came back 11 minutes later with a printed map that he laid across the table. Victor stood over it and didn't say anything for a long time. The failures formed a shape, not a perfect shape, not something that would jump out at a casual observer, but something that Victor recognized because he had spent 22 years learning to see patterns in data that wanted to look like noise. The failures formed a protective perimeter around a moving center. The center was the SEAL team's position. The perimeter moved with them. She's been with them the whole time, Victor said. Garrett looked at the map and said, I'm sorry, whoever this is, the person managing this. He paused. I don't know that it's a woman, but the tactical signature is specific. The level of restraint is specific. Every intervention is the minimum necessary to produce the desired outcome. No excess, no statement, no signature beyond what the mission requires. He traced a finger along the edge of the pattern. Most operators, even the best ones, leave a signature because most operators have an ego investment in their own methods. They develop a style. This person doesn't have a style. They have a principle. What principle? Efficiency. Absolute efficiency. The intervention is always exactly what the situation needs and never anything more. That's not training. You can teach someone to be efficient. You cannot teach someone to be only efficient. That's identity. He straightened up. This person has been doing this for a very long time, and they have been doing it alone. Garrett crossed his arms and looked at the map. If they're that good, how do we find them? We don't find them, Victor said. We make them find us. He picked up the map and started folding it. I need you to get me everything on unexplained mission anomalies in the last 5 years. Not domestic, international. Any operation where enemy action failed in a manner inconsistent with the known capability of the protected unit. Cross-reference the geographic distribution. Look for overlap. Garrett stared at him. That could be thousands of incidents. Then you should probably start now, Victor said. He walked out of the building and into the cold morning air, and he breathed it in slowly, and he looked at the mountains surrounding the valley, and he thought about the shape he had seen on that topographical map. A protective perimeter. Moving. He had seen something like it once before. Once 12 years ago when he had been on the other side of the equation, when someone had been protecting him. He hadn't known it at the time. He had found out years later from a classified briefing that had been assembled after the fact about an intelligence operative named Daniel Reeves, who had run a series of deep cover protection operations across 4 continents over an 8-year period. Reeves had died 4 years ago during a failed extraction in circumstances that were still only partially declassified. But what Victor remembered from that briefing was not Reeves himself. It was the note about his methods, specifically the note about the person who had been trained to continue those methods after Reeves expected to eventually be killed in the line of duty. He had not thought about that briefing in 3 years. He thought about it now. He went back inside and pulled out his personal encrypted tablet and sent a single message to a contact number that most people in his professional world did not know he had. The message contained 6 words. Daniel Reeves, who did he train? He put the tablet down and looked at the 7 field reports on the table. 7 failures, and a pattern that kept moving. Somewhere in these mountains, a ghost was keeping 11 soldiers alive. And ghosts Victor knew could only exist if everyone agreed not to look directly at them. He was done agreeing. Meanwhile, 40 kilometers to the northeast in the temporary command shelter that served as the SEAL team's operational hub for the duration of the mission, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. Captain Ryan Mitchell had not slept in 31 hours. Not because he couldn't, Ryan Mitchell had the military man's practiced ability to sleep in hostile conditions in short intervals, in positions that would be considered medically inadvisable by anyone who hadn't spent time in the field. He could sleep. He was choosing not to because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. He saw the ambush on day 4 that hadn't happened. 4 enemy combatants had been positioned on the high ground above the eastern approach, and his unit had been moving directly toward them, and the men on the high ground had had every tactical advantage: clear sight lines, elevation, a narrow approach that eliminated flanking options. Ryan had run the scenario in his head so many times that the math was essentially solved. They would have lost at least 3 men, possibly 5. The ambush hadn't happened. The 4 combatants had pulled back 20 minutes before the SEAL team came into range. No radio communication from enemy command had been intercepted. No change in the broader tactical situation to explain it. They had simply left. Ethan Brooks, the team's intelligence officer, a wiry man from Idaho who had the infuriating quality of being right about things before he could explain why, had spent 40 minutes at the data terminal trying to find an explanation and had eventually come to Ryan with the kind of expression that meant the explanation he had found was one he didn't want to say out loud. "Tell me," Ryan said. "There's no clean tactical explanation for what's been happening," Ethan said. "The pattern of enemy failures doesn't correspond to any known breakdown in their command structure. Their communications have been consistent. Their supply lines have been intact. There's no indication of internal discord or leadership problems." Ryan waited. Ethan pulled up a map on his tablet and turned it toward Ryan. "But if you look at the spatial pattern of the failures," he said, "and you model it against our own movement over the last 9 days, you get something interesting." Ryan looked at the map. He looked at it for a long time. "Someone is running interference," he said. "That would be consistent with the pattern, yes. Someone who isn't part of our unit." "There's no one in our unit I can't account for," Ethan said. "And the scale of what would have had to happen to create this pattern, a single unit member doing it on the side that's not operationally feasible. So it's external." "It's external." Ryan set the tablet down on the folding table and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "Who knows about this?" he asked. "Just me. I haven't put it in the daily report." "Keep it that way for now." Ethan looked at him steadily. "You don't want to report it." "I want to understand it before I report it," Ryan said, "because the moment this goes up the chain, the focus shifts from completing our mission to identifying the external variable. And if whoever is out there doing this knows that we know it might change what they're doing, and I don't want to change what they're doing." He paused. "I want to know if they're still out there." Ethan nodded. "I can set up a passive sensor array on the perimeter. Pressure sensitive. It won't broadcast, it'll just record. If something is moving around us that we're not seeing, we'll have data in 48 hours. Do it quietly," Ryan said. Ethan left. Ryan stood alone in the operational shelter and looked at the map on the tablet for a while longer. "I thought about what kind of person did something like this. Ran interference for a unit they weren't part of. Kept people alive without acknowledgement. Moved through hostile terrain alone, without backup, without the knowledge of the people they were protecting." He tried to construct a profile in his mind and found that the profile kept sliding away from him because every time he tried to define the motivation, it came back to the same impossible answer. They did it because the soldiers needed to survive, not for recognition, not for operational credit, just because the soldiers needed to survive. Ryan had known a lot of brave people in his career. He had served with men and women who had done extraordinary things in the worst possible circumstances. But bravery was always, at least in part, a social act. Bravery happened in front of witnesses, or it happened with the knowledge that witnesses would eventually exist. Even the most private acts of courage carried the implicit structure of a story that could someday be told. What Ethan's analysis was pointing to was something different. This wasn't bravery. This was something older than bravery. He picked up the tablet and turned it off. Outside the shelter, Marcus Webb was doing equipment maintenance with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything Marcus did. Torres was checking supplies. David Park was writing in the small journal he carried everywhere, which he maintained with the determined privacy of a man who understood that some things needed to go somewhere that wasn't just inside your own head. Ryan watched them for a moment. 11 people, alive because of someone who was choosing not to be known. He walked back inside and started writing his own report. He wrote exactly what Ethan had told him to write. The standard operational summary. He left out the analysis about the external variable. He left out the sensor array. He kept that and the question it was trying to answer entirely to himself. At 400 hours on day 10, Garrett came back to Victor Kane with the cross-reference analysis. Victor was in the middle of a protein bar he wasn't tasting and a tactical assessment he had already completed twice when Garrett laid a folder on the table with the particular care of a man who understood that the contents represented a significant amount of work and wanted credit for that without explicitly asking for it. 47 incidents over 5 years, Garrett said. 8 different countries, 4 different types of operations ranging from direct action, support to humanitarian security to intelligence gathering. Victor opened the folder. Cross-reference pattern, he asked. Geographic distribution is consistent with a single operator. The intervals between incidents suggest a solo individual rather than a rotating team, because a team would have more frequent activity and more variation in tactical signature. The signature is consistent. And here's the thing. Victor looked up. Garrett leaned forward slightly. In every single incident, the protected unit was never aware of the protection. Not once, not a single after-action report from any of these 47 operations contains any reference to an unidentified third party. Whatever this person is doing, they are leaving no evidence detectable by the units themselves. Victor set the folder down. They only become visible through the enemy's failures. Exactly. Which means the only way to track them is from the enemy's side of the equation, which is where we are. Victor thought about this for a moment. The response to my message came back, he said. He picked up his encrypted tablet and showed Garrett the screen. One name, Garrett read it. Maya Carter, he said. Former intelligence asset, trained directly by Daniel Reeves for a period of approximately 4 years. Recruited at age 22 from a background I can't fully access, which means the background is either classified above my clearance or has been deliberately scrubbed. The classification file on her has one active designation. Garrett looked at the screen. Unsupported field asset, he read. What does that mean? It means she operates without official backing, without a support structure, without a unit, without resources drawn from any identifiable budget line. She runs herself, she funds herself, she chooses her own missions. Victor paused. Or she did. After Reeves died, we assume the program died with him. There's been no official activity attributed to this designation in 4 years. He took the tablet back. Apparently we were wrong. Garrett sat down across the table. What's her training profile? Everything, Victor said simply. Reeves trained her in everything, but her specific specialization based on the mission reports from the period when she was active and officially acknowledged was deep cover protection of high-value units in denied areas. She doesn't fight with the units she protects. She fights around them. She removes threats before they materialize. She is, by the operational definition, a perfect guardian. And she's been doing this alone for 4 years. Yes. And she's protecting the SEAL team right now. Yes. Garrett was quiet for a moment. So what do? Victor closed the folder. We find her, he said, but not by looking for her. We already know that doesn't work. We find her by giving her a reason to reveal herself. He stood up and walked to the bare wall where he had pinned a fresh topographic map of the extraction corridor. The extraction is in 26 hours, he said. The team has one viable route, 3 possible corridors through the terrain, and only one that's tactically feasible given their current position and the enemy's known disposition. He traced the route with his finger. She knows this. She has to know this. She's been watching them for 10 days. He put his finger on a specific point in the corridor. She also knows that this is the choke point, the narrowest section, the one place where the terrain eliminates all flanking options and forces the unit into a predictable line of movement. He turned to face Garrett. We're going to fill that choke point with enough force to make it impassable. And we're going to do it in a way that she can see but cannot neutralize without revealing herself. Garrett frowned. She's been neutralizing things without revealing herself for 10 days. Individual threats, yes. Small units, isolated positions, predictable patterns. But if we concentrate enough force in a confined space, the only way to protect the SEAL team is to engage directly. To be present in the fight. He paused. To be visible. The word landed between them with the weight it deserved. Garrett said carefully, You're going to force a ghost into the light. I'm going to give her a choice, Victor said. Remain invisible and let 11 men die, or show herself and save them. He said it without inflection, the way you said things that were tactically correct, but cost you something to look at directly. She's been protecting these men for 10 days. Whatever her professional discipline, whatever her training, there's a human investment there. She cares about them. Not personally, maybe, but she chose them. She chose to be there. That choice creates attachment, and attachment is a leverage point. He turned back to the map. We'll move the blocking force into position tonight. I want it done quietly in stages so she doesn't see the full picture until it's too late to find an alternative. He picked up a red marker and drew a line across the choke point. She'll have to cross this line, he said, and then almost to himself, barely loud enough for Garrett to hear. Let's see who you really are. 22 kilometers away. Maya was crouched in a narrow rock formation at 01:30 hours with her back against cold stone and her eyes closed, which was not a sign of exhaustion, but of concentration. She could process information faster with her eyes closed when she was working a problem. She had learned this about herself in her second year of training, when Daniel had made her sit in a dark room for 6 hours with only audio data and then asked her to reconstruct the tactical situation she had heard. She had been better at it than either of them expected. She was reconstructing the tactical situation now. The anomaly she had detected in the enemy's movement pattern was 17 hours old, which meant she had been working on it for 17 hours, which meant it was either very complex or she was missing something fundamental. She suspected the latter. The enemy forces in the valley had been repositioning for the last full day in a pattern that was not consistent with either offensive action or defensive consolidation. It was consistent with something she had seen described once in a classified paper about tactical deception operations that Daniel had made her read. It was consistent with herding. Small groups, subtle movements. Nothing that would register as an aggressive posture, but each small movement was pushing in the same general direction, and the direction they were pushing was toward the extraction corridor. Specifically toward the choke point that she had identified on her map 12 days ago as the single most vulnerable point on the team's road home. They were building a funnel, and the wide end of the funnel pointed at the SEAL team's current position. She opened her eyes. She picked up her field notebook and looked at the notation she had made 8 days ago. He thinks like me. She had written it about an unknown variable, a shadow within the enemy operation that she had begun detecting through the specific quality of their failures, the failures that she hadn't caused. Enemy actions that had been terminated or redirected not by her intervention, but by something else. Something that was using her methods. She had been so focused on protecting the team that she had not spent enough time thinking about that shadow. She thought about it now. Someone had been studying her work the same way she studied the enemy, reconstructing her methods from their effects, building a model of how she operated. And now they were building a trap using the one thing they correctly understood about her. She would not let the team walk into that choke point unprotected, which meant she would be at the choke point, which meant she would walk into a position that had been designed to expose her. She sat with this for a moment. Then she did something she almost never did. She pulled out the small battered compass from her hip pocket, the one Daniel had given her, and she held it in her closed fist for a moment without looking at it. Just held it. She was thinking about a conversation she and Daniel had had late in her training during a night exercise that had gone wrong in several instructive ways when they were sitting in cold darkness, waiting for conditions to allow them to move. She had asked him that night what he was afraid of. He had been quiet for long enough that she assumed he wasn't going to answer. Then he had said, "I'm afraid of the mission that has no right answer, the one where every choice costs something real." She had asked him what he did when he found that mission. He had said, "You make the choice that costs you something, because the choice that costs nothing is the one you're making for your own comfort. And comfort is not the job." She opened her hand and looked at the compass. The needle pointed north. She put it back in her pocket. She had 18 hours before the extraction window opened. 18 hours to figure out how to get 11 men through a choke point that was being built into a kill zone by someone who understood exactly how she thought. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top of the page, she wrote, "What would I do if I were him?" and then she started writing. She wrote fast in the small, precise handwriting that filled the notebook in dense lines, not editing, just thinking on paper, building the tactical picture from the perspective of someone who wanted to trap her. What resources would he have? What timeline would he be working with? What assumptions would he be making about her behavior? The assumptions. That was where she would find the edge. He would assume she would approach the choke point from the most protected angle, from high ground with sight lines, with the kind of overwatch position that allowed maximum flexibility of action. He would cover those angles. He would assume she would try to eliminate threats ahead of time before the team entered the quarter. He would set his forces to trigger on early activity in the approach zone. He would assume she would try to do what she had been doing for 10 days. Minimize exposure, maximize effectiveness, keep herself invisible. He would be right about all of it, which meant she had to do something none of those assumptions covered. She wrote 2 words at the bottom of the page: move first. Not move first to the observation position, not move first to the choke point, move first to him. She closed the notebook. The person who had been studying her, who had built this trap, who had sent the message, find the absence, who thought like her, who was somewhere in these mountains running an operation she hadn't been able to fully map. How was the variable? Not his forces, not his blocking positions, not the tactical detail of the choke point. Him. If she could find him before he was ready for her to find him, everything he had built became a problem for a different version of this situation, a version where she had already changed the equation. She checked the time, 17 hours and 43 minutes. She stood up, settled her pack, and started moving in a direction that was entirely opposite to where he would expect her to be, toward him. Garrett brought Victor the field updated at 2 hours and found his commander standing at the window with a cup of something that wasn't good coffee and the expression of a man who had been thinking hard for a long time. Blocking forces in position, Garrett said. All 3 elements. The choke point is covered from 6 angles. We have thermal overwatch on both approach corridors. Victor didn't turn around. Has anything moved on our perimeter in the last 6 hours? Garrett checked his tablet. Negative. Sensors have been clean. Victor was quiet for a moment. That's wrong, he said. Garrett looked up from the tablet. The sensors are wrong. Not the sensors, the situation. Victor turned from the window. His expression was sharp in a way that Garrett associated with significant realizations, the kind that arrived without announcing themselves and rearranged everything that came before. She's had 10 days to study this team. She knows their extraction route. She knows about the choke point she would have identified it on day 1 as the critical vulnerability. She's had between 6 and 12 hours to detect our blocking force moving into position. He set down the cup. Where is she? Garrett said nothing because he didn't have an answer. She should be reacting, Victor said. She should be moving on the choke point. She should be trying to find a way to neutralize our blocking force before the team enters the corridor. Instead, there's nothing. He moved to the table and then looked at the map. She's not at the choke point. She's not on the overwatch positions. She's not where I expected her to be. He looked up, which means she's already figured out what I'm doing. He said it quietly with a particular kind of professional respect that he rarely gave anyone. And she's not trying to solve the problem I gave her. He looked at the door of the building, then back at the map. She's trying to solve me. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. Get everyone on internal security, he said. Now, full perimeter, nothing in or out. Garrett was already on the radio. But Victor wasn't watching him. He was standing very still in the middle of the room and he was thinking about what he would do if he were her. And a slow, specific kind of cold was working its way up his spine. Because if he were her and he had figured out that the trap was built around his expectation of her behavior, the first thing he would do was identify the single person whose expectations were creating the trap. He would come for the source. He would come for Victor. He walked to the window and looked out at the perimeter. He could see the guards, their positions, their sight lines. He looked for the absence. And in the tree line 40 meters past the eastern guard position, in a section of dead ground that the perimeter lights didn't quite reach, he saw the shape of a person standing completely still, looking directly at him. For exactly 2 seconds, Victor Kane and Maya Carter looked at each other across 40 meters of darkness. Then she was gone. She moved so cleanly, so completely, that Victor would spend the next 48 hours trying to decide whether he had actually seen her or whether his own mind primed to look for her had constructed her from shadows and expectation. But in that moment he knew. She had found him, before he had found her, and she had wanted him to know it. He stood at the window for a long time after she disappeared. Then he sat down at the table and looked at the map, and he looked at his blocking force positions, and he thought about what it meant that she had come all the way to the edge of his perimeter, not to engage him, not to eliminate the threat he represented, but simply to show him that she could. She was giving him a message, the same message he realized that he had been trying to send her. I see you. And standing at that window with the cold coming in through the frame and the operational map spread on the table, and 12 hours before 11, soldiers tried to walk through a kill zone he had built to force her into the light. Victor Kane did something that surprised him. He started to reconsider. Not the mission, the approach. Because something had changed in the calculation. Something had shifted when he saw her standing in the tree line completely exposed looking at him. Not threatening, not attacking, just present, just visible, just saying without words in the language of people who lived in the spaces between other people's missions, I know what you're doing, and I know why, and I'm still here. He pulled the map toward him and studied the choke point. I thought about what she had been doing for 10 days and what she was about to face, and he thought about Daniel Reeves in the briefing he had read 3 years ago. And he thought about what it meant to build a trap for a person whose entire purpose was keeping other people alive. He picked up his red marker. He put it back down. He looked at the map for a long time. And in the cold pre-dawn quiet of a building that smelled like old livestock and bad decisions, Victor Kane sat with the uncomfortable reality that the most effective thing he had ever hunted might also be the most necessary. 12 hours. The team would move in 12 hours. And Maya Carter was somewhere out there in the dark, already adapting, already planning, already carrying 11 lives that weren't hers toward an exit she wasn't sure existed. He picked up the red marker again. This time he used it to circle the choke point. And next to the circle, he wrote a single word, wait. The word Victor had written on the map was still there at 0600 hours. When Garrett came back in with fresh field reports and found his commander sitting in exactly the same position, jacket still on, coffee untouched, and staring at that single circled word like it owed him something. You didn't sleep, Garrett said. I was thinking. For 4 hours. It was a complicated thought. Victor pushed the map aside and picked up the field reports without looking at them. What's the status of the blocking force? All positions holding. No movement from the SEAL team. They're still in their night position. Extraction window opens in 6 hours. And our perimeter, Garrett paused. Clean. Whatever you saw last night didn't trigger any of the sensors. Victor set the reports down without reading them. Because she didn't cross the sensor line, he said. She was inside the dead zone. She knew exactly where the sensors were. He rubbed his face with both hands, the single concession to fatigue he would allow himself. She came that close just to make a point. She was telling me she could have come further. Garrett sat down slowly across the table. What are we doing, Victor? It was the first time in 4 years that Garrett had called him by his first name during an active operation. Victor noticed it the way you noticed a calibration shift in a piece of equipment you trusted absolutely. We're running an interdiction operation, Victor said. We're building a trap for someone who has spent 10 days keeping 11 American soldiers alive, Garrett said. I want to make sure I understand what the outcome looks like, because the blocking force in that corridor is not a capture operation. Those are combat assets. The word landed between them. Victor didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked to the window. The morning had come cold and gray, the kind of flat light that made everything look exactly as complicated as it was. She saw me, Victor said. Last night, I saw her and she saw me, and she didn't engage. She was alone against a hardened perimeter. That hasn't stopped her for 10 days. He turned from the window. She was sending a message. She has been from the beginning. Every intervention, every cleared threat, every enemy failure. It's all been the same message. He looked at the map on the table. Don't make me cross this line. Garrett waited. But I built a situation where crossing the line is the only way to save the team, Victor said. I gave her a binary choice. Reveal yourself or let them die. That was the plan. Yes, he picked up the red marker. It was the plan. He looked at the circled word on the map, the word wait. The problem is that I've been thinking about this from an operational perspective, identifying a variable, neutralizing it, controlling the outcome. But she isn't a variable. Then what is she? Victor set the marker down. She's the mission, he said quietly. She has been for 6 years and probably longer. She's not a person doing a job. She's a person who made a choice about what their life was for. He paused. And I built a situation that was going to cost her everything in exchange for what exactly? Confirming that she exists. The room was very quiet. Garrett said, "The contractors are paid and in position. Walking this back has a cost." "Everything has a cost," Victor said. "That's what I told myself last night while I was sitting here not sleeping. Every choice costs something." He straightened up. "Get me a secure line to the contractor team leader." "To give what order?" "I'll tell you when I'm on the line," Victor said. But before Garrett could reach for the radio, the sensor board on the east wall produced a sound that neither of them had heard since it was installed, a proximity alert inside the perimeter. They both looked at the board. The alert was coming from the interior courtyard. Not the external approach, the interior, which meant something or someone was already inside the perimeter fence. Victor crossed the room in 4 steps and looked at the sensor readout, one signature. Stationary, positioned directly outside the building's east-facing wall. He and Garrett looked at each other. Then Victor walked to the east wall to the window that had no glass, and he leaned out carefully and looked down. On the ground below the window, someone had placed a single object. It was a folded piece of paper. Victor stared at it for 3 full seconds. Then he went outside, retrieved it, and came back in. He unfolded it. The handwriting was small and precise. 6 lines, no greeting, no signature. He read it twice. Then he handed it to Garrett without a word. Garrett read it. It said the choke point has a third approach you haven't covered. I found it 2 hours ago. Oh, I can neutralize your blocking positions from it in approximately 11 minutes if I need to. I don't want to need to. You built this trap because you think you need to know who I am. You already know who I am. You know what I do and why I do it. You know what I won't allow to happen to those 11 men. The only question left between us is whether you're going to make me prove it. And if you make me prove it, someone gets hurt. Maybe me, maybe yours. The team gets through either way. But I'd rather it cost nothing. Your call." Garrett looked up from the note. Victor was already at the table picking up the radio. "This is Kane," he said into it. "All blocking positions, stand down. Pull back to secondary staging and hold. Do not engage anything in the corridor. Acknowledge." One by one, the team leaders acknowledged. Garrett set the note down carefully on the table like it was something that mattered. "She was inside our perimeter again," he said. "Yes." She put that note down and walked out without triggering a single sensor. "Yes," Garrett sat down. "Who trained her?" he asked. "The best man I ever saw do this kind of work," Victor said. He looked at the note. "And she's better than he was." 6 kilometers northeast, Maya was 300 meters past the perimeter she had walked out of 40 minutes ago, moving steadily toward the SEAL team's position, when she felt the thing she had been tracking for 2 hours finally stop moving. The contractor, blocking force, had been withdrawing from the choke point in stages. She had been monitoring their movement through the spotting scope, counting the withdrawal, confirming that the positions were actually clearing and not just changing depth. She had been burned before by what looked like a withdrawal and turned out to be a redeployment. But this was real. Position by position, they were pulling back. She stopped walking. She stood still in an early morning cold and breathed and let herself feel the relief for exactly 5 seconds. Not because she was soft about such things, but because she had learned from Daniel that refusing to acknowledge relief was not toughness. It was a waste of information. Your body told you when the weight had shifted. Ignoring that made you slower. 5 seconds. Then she moved. She had 4 hours before the extraction window opened. 4 hours to get ahead of the team's route and confirm the corridor was clean, not just of Victor's assets, but of the original enemy forces who had been operating in the valley before Victor arrived. In the last 48 hours of managing the approach to the note, she had not been covering the team's flanks the way she normally did. That meant there was a gap in her situational awareness that she needed to close before 11 men started walking through it. She picked up her pace. At 0743 hours, Ryan Mitchell woke up with the particular alertness of someone whose body had decided sleep was finished, regardless of whether rest had been achieved. He had managed 4 hours. He sat up and looked at his watch, and then at the operational shelter, where Ethan was already awake and in front of the data terminal. "Anything overnight?" Ryan asked. Ethan turned from the terminal with an expression Ryan had learned to read as complicated. "The passive sensors registered 7 movement events between 0100 and 0300 hours," Ethan said. Ryan stood up. 7. All of them at distances between 30 and 50 meters from the perimeter. None of them came closer, and none of them registered on the standard watch rotation, which means whoever or whatever was moving was doing so in the sensor gaps. Ethan turned his tablet toward Ryan. "There's also this." Ryan looked at the screen. It was a thermal trace, a residual heat signature from approximately 0140 hours captured by the passive system on the north side of the camp. The signature was human-shaped, single person, standing still, facing the camp, for 8 minutes, then gone. Ryan looked at the timestamp, 0148 to 0156 hours. He looked at Ethan. "Were any of ours outside the perimeter at that time?" "No," Ryan handed the tablet back. "How long has it been out there?" he asked. "Not what or who. How long?" Ethan understood the question. "Based on the pattern from the sensors, I think they have been running a protective perimeter around us for at least 8 days. Possibly longer." He paused. "The gaps in enemy activity correlate directly with these sensor readings when I go back and overlay them. Every time the sensors caught a movement event close to our perimeter, there was a corresponding failure in enemy action within the following 2 to 6 hours. Ryan absorbed this. "They're not just watching us," he said. "No," Ethan said. "They're working." Ryan went to the shelter entrance and looked out at the morning. The rest of the team was stirring. Marcus was up running his morning weapons check with the quiet focus of a man who found comfort in the predictable. Torres was making something that would generously be described as coffee. Park had put his journal away and was stretching in the way of someone whose body was carrying several days of accumulated tension. These were the men who had been watched over for 8 days. These were the men someone had chosen to stay alive. Ryan went back inside. "When we move," he said to Ethan, "what's the tactical picture look like?" "Better than it should," Ethan said carefully. "Enemy force distribution in the extraction corridor has been inconsistent in the last 48 hours. There have been movements that I can't fully explain based on known command structure. Some of their forward positions appear to have gone quiet in a way that's different from previous patterns." "Quiet how?" "Like they were told to wait." Ethan paused. "Or like something removed the need for them to act." Ryan thought about the thermal signature. 8 minutes, standing in the dark 40 meters from his camp, watching them sleep. Not to attack, just to watch. "We move on schedule," Ryan said. "Extraction window in 4 hours. Full kit, full speed." "Ryan," Ethan said it quietly, "what do we do about the other thing, the sensor data, the pattern, when we file the after action?" "File what the mission produced," Ryan said. "File the enemy failures as observed. File the tactical anomalies as observed." He paused. "Don't explain them." Ethan nodded slowly. "Someone protected us," he said. "Yes. And we're just going to walk out and not know who." Ryan looked at the entrance of the shelter at the slice of cold Montana morning, invisible beyond it. "We're going to walk out alive," he said. "That's who." 80900 hours. Victor Kane drove to the edge of the extraction corridor and parked the truck and got out and stood at the side of the road for a long time. Garrett had stayed at the operational base to handle the contractor withdrawal. Victor was alone, which was how he preferred to work when he was thinking through something that didn't have a clean resolution. The corridor was empty. His blocking force was gone. The enemy positions that had been building toward the choke point had also, for reasons he was still piecing together, largely dissolved. He wasn't sure whether Maya had cleared them or whether the withdrawal of his own assets had changed the enemy's tactical calculus. Maybe both. And had a satellite phone in his jacket pocket with a connection to his operational chain of command, and at some point today he was going to have to make a call and explain the outcome of this operation. He had found the variable. He had identified it specifically. He had confirmed its identity and its operational methodology and its current field status. He had then stood down his entire blocking force based on a handwritten note left under a window. The conversation was going to be interesting. He pulled out the note and read it again. "You know what I do and why I do it." He folded it and put it back in his pocket. The thing that stayed with him, the thing that had been staying with him since 0320 hours was the last line. Your call. She had given him a choice. Not a threat, not an ultimatum. A choice. She had walked into his perimeter twice when she could have engaged his force or bypassed it or done a dozen things that would have resolved her immediate problem without requiring communication. But she had communicated. She had used the language of trust. He wasn't sure he had earned that. He wasn't sure she was right to offer it, but she had. He was still thinking about this when his phone rang. The number on the screen was not one he recognized. The encryption header was not from his operational chain. He answered it, silence for 2 seconds. Then a woman's voice, low and entirely calm. You read it, she said. Victor went very still. I read it, he said. And you pulled back. Yes, another pause. I was trying to triangulate her position from background sound and getting nothing useful. No whine noise, which meant that she was sheltered or indoors. No mechanical ambient, which eliminated vehicles. She could be anywhere. Why, she asked. The question was simple, and she asked it without challenge, without suspicion. She genuinely wanted to know. Because you were right, Victor said. I know what you do. That's not why. He paused. She was correct. That wasn't why, or not the whole reason. He had known what she did before he wrote wait on the map, and he still had the blocking force in position. The choke point, he said, you said you could clear it in 11 minutes. Roughly. I believe you. That's also not why, she said. He looked at the empty corridor. No, he said, it's not. I didn't know how to say the thing that was actually true, which was that seeing her standing in the tree line at 150 hours, completely visible, completely exposed, had done something to the operational calculus that pure tactical logic couldn't explain. She had shown him exactly who she was in that moment, not by telling him, by standing there. Daniel Reeves, he said finally. Silence. You were in the briefing, she said. It wasn't a question. 3 years ago, I read about the program, about what he was building, about the philosophy. And I spent 20 years in this business, Victor said. I've worked with the best operators in 4 branches and across 11 countries. I have never seen a tactical signature like yours. Not once, he paused. I thought I needed to find you because you were a variable that could affect operational security. But what I actually really wanted to know was whether someone like you was real. A long pause, then very quietly she said, someone like me. Someone who does this without wanting anything for it. Another pause. Longer this time. I want them to get home, she said. And the simplicity of it, the absolute absence of performance in the way she said it, stopped him cold. That's what I want. It's the only thing I've wanted for 6 years. Victor looked at the corridor. The extraction window opens in 3 hours, he said. I know. The corridor is clear on my end. Enemy disposition in the approach zone is fragmented. There are 2 residual positions in the secondary terrain that I haven't fully accounted for. I know about those too, she said. I'll handle them before the team enters the zone. I can redirect 2 of my assets to support. No, she said, not harshly, just definitively. This is my operation, she said. It stays clean. He understood. Clean meant no additional variables. Clean meant she controlled the environment completely and owed nothing to anyone else's judgment. All right, he said, another silence, and this one had a different quality, not confrontational, something closer to the end of a conversation that neither of them entirely wanted to be finished. What happens now, he asked. On your end. The team gets out. The team gets out, she said, and I move to the next one. There's always a next one. Yes. I thought about the 47 incidents. 8 countries, 5 years, always alone, always invisible, always the next one. Is that sustainable, he asked. He heard something in the silence that followed, not offense exactly, more like the sound of a person looking at a question they had already answered 1,000 times in private. Daniel thought it was, she said. Daniel died. Yes, she said, he did. The weight of that sat between them on an encrypted line in a cold Montana morning. The team's lucky you found them, Victor said. I found them on day 2, she said. I've been waiting for you since day 3. He processed that. You knew someone was looking. I knew the pattern had changed. I didn't know who yet. A pause. You're better than most. "You're better than me," he said. It cost him something to say it, and he said it anyway, demonstrably. The quietest sound that might have been something almost like a laugh. "Don't tell anyone," she said. Then the line was dead. Victor stood at the edge of the corridor for a while longer. The morning had warmed slightly, the flat gray light giving way to something thinner and more honest. He put the phone back in his pocket. He thought about the note. I thought about her voice on the phone, the particular quality of calm that wasn't detachment, but something more disciplined than calm. The voice of someone who had learned to carry enormous weight without letting it change the pitch of how they spoke. He thought about Daniel Reeves. He took out his own small notebook, the one he carried for operational notes, and he opened it to a blank page and wrote something he would normally never put in writing. He wrote, "She is the most effective field asset I have ever encountered. She operates without support, without recognition, without resources beyond her own capability and judgment. She carries the mission as an identity, not a profession." He stopped. He looked at what he had written. Then he wrote one more line. "The program should not have died with Reeves. This needs to exist. Someone needs to make sure it continues." He closed the notebook. Then he got back in the truck and drove toward the staging area to begin the paperwork of an operation that had ended in a way he hadn't anticipated and was going to be very difficult to explain accurately. At 10:47 hours, Ryan Mitchell gave the order to move. The team assembled with the quiet efficiency of men who had been waiting for this moment long enough that the waiting had become its own kind of discipline. 11 people, full kit, moving toward home through terrain that had tried to swallow them for nearly 2 weeks. Ryan took the point position himself, which was not strictly the captain's role, but which he had always preferred in extraction phases, because the point saw what was coming first, and he wanted to be the one making the first decision. They entered the corridor at 1103 hours. The first kilometer was clean. Too clean, Ryan thought. For terrain that had been actively hostile for 11 days, the silence felt constructed. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of something that had been prepared. He kept moving. The second kilometer brought them to the narrowest section of the approach, the choke point, the geography that had kept him awake 3 nights running when he had first mapped the extraction route and realized there was no alternative. He stopped the team at the entrance to the choke point. Marcus came up alongside him. "What do you see?" Marcus said quietly. "Nothing," Ryan said. "Is that good?" "I genuinely don't know." He studied the terrain above the choke point, the ridgelines, the positions that an enemy would occupy to cover this approach. Empty. But the emptiness had a shape to it. He had felt this before, this particular quality of absence that wasn't natural vacancy, but deliberate clearance. He had felt it on day 4 when the ambush hadn't happened, on day 7 when the patrol had turned south. It was the feeling of something having already been done, of work already completed, of someone already having been there. "We move," he said, fast and quiet, full spread. "Don't bunch up in the narrow section." They moved. Ryan counted the seconds in his head as they came through the narrowest point. 8 meters of confined approach, where the terrain pushed them into a single file, and the ridge lines above offered every tactical advantage to anyone positioned on them. 12 seconds. Then they were through. The corridor opened up ahead of them, widening toward the extraction landing zone where the helicopter was scheduled in 47 minutes. Ryan exhaled. Behind him, he heard Torres say very quietly to Park, "That was the part I was worried about." "Me too," Park said. Marcus moved up next to Ryan again. "Someone cleared it," Marcus said. Low, just for Ryan. "Yes." "Our side, I don't know whose side," Ryan said. Marcus looked at him. "But someone cleared it for us." "Yes," Ryan said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Huh," he said finally. The word carried the weight of a man who had a lot more to say and was choosing not to say most of it. "Yeah," Ryan said. They kept moving. At 11 hours, 2 kilometers east of the extraction zone, Maya was lying on a flat section of rock above the secondary terrain where the 2 residual enemy positions had been operating. She had cleared the first one at 134 hours, neutralized without engagement. The 4-man unit redirected by a combination of radio interference and a pressure trigger she had rigged on the road they were watching, which had sent them north on a security sweep that would take them out of any relevant area for the next 6 hours. The second position had been more difficult. It was a 2-man sniper unit that had set up in a location she hadn't identified until 9:20 hours, which was later than she was comfortable with. They were good. They had found a position with minimal signature, no thermal overhang, no sound discipline errors. She had found them because one of them had a watch that reflected the morning light for a half second when he shifted his position, and she had caught the reflection from 600 meters on a scan she almost hadn't done. She was grateful for the compulsive thoroughness Daniel had beaten into her. She had been watching the sniper team for 90 minutes now. They were positioned for coverage of the extraction landing zone, which meant they had been told the approximate location of the pickup, which meant the enemy's intelligence about the team's extraction was better than the operational planners had assumed. She needed to neutralize this position before the helicopter arrived. She had two options. The first was the approach she had used for 10 days. Indirect neutralization. Create a condition that forces withdrawal without direct engagement. The problem was time. She had 31 minutes before the helicopter window. An indirect approach required preparation time she no longer had. The second option was direct. She lay still and thought about it for 12 seconds, which was all the time she had to allocate to the decision. Then she began moving. She came down the rock, face on the side away from their sight line, and worked her way around the base of the formation in the dead ground that the position's own elevation created. Dead ground was always available somewhere. The physics of observation created it inevitably the shadow of the hill, the angle that the eye couldn't follow. Every net had a hole. She found this one at the back of the formation, where the rock curved inward and the ground dropped 6 feet into a shallow gully that the sniper team would not be covering because it offered no sightline to anything they were tasked to watch. She went in through the gully. She came up behind the position from the angle it couldn't see. What happened in the next 4 minutes, she did not think about afterward in terms of what it required her to do. She thought about it in terms of what it protected. The two-man team was alive when she left the position. That had been a choice she made with the same precision she made every other choice, because the minimum necessary outcome was the goal, not the maximum possible damage. She moved away from the position and checked her watch. 22 minutes to the extraction window. She climbed back to the high point she had vacated and raised her spotting scope. The SEAL team was 2 kilometers out and moving well. Ryan was on point. She could tell his movement pattern from this distance without needing to see his face. She watched them for a moment. She thought about what Victor Kane had said on the phone. She is the most effective field asset. Not what he had said, what he might have said, what the note in his notebook might have read if she could have seen it. She didn't know about the notebook. She didn't know about the note he had written, but she knew the tone in his voice when he said he believed her about the 11 minutes. It was the tone of a person who recognized something and was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. She respected honesty. She watched the team move. 14 minutes to the extraction window. She swept the landing zone with the spotting scope. The 2 residual positions were neutralized. The blocking force withdrawal was complete. The corridor between the team and the landing zone was clean. Her work was done. She should start moving to her extraction route. She should be thinking about the next step, the long walk out, the careful management of the wound on her forearm that had gotten angrier in the last 12 hours and needed proper attention. She wasn't going to be able to give it for at least another day. She should be transitioning. Instead, she watched them walk. She watched Ryan at the point, the way he moved through terrain, reading it with the kind of attention that came from years of practice. She watched Marcus on the left flank, Torres staying close to Ryan, Park with his journal in his chest pocket and his weapon in his hands and his face forward. She watched them until they were 1 kilometer from the landing zone. She watched them until the sound of the helicopter reached her position, a deep rotary rhythm that bounced off the mountain walls and filled the valley. She watched the team stop and spread into landing zone security positions with the automatic precision of people who had done this exact thing many times. She watched Ryan look up at the approaching aircraft and say something she couldn't hear from this distance that made Marcus nod. She watched them get on. She watched the helicopter lift. She watched until it was a shape against the sky, then a sound, then nothing. The valley was quiet. She lowered the spotting scope. Her forearm hurt. The cold had gotten into her joints in the last hour, in the way it always did when adrenaline cleared and the body reasserted its actual condition. She sat with the quiet for a moment. She thought about Daniel. She pulled the compass from her hip pocket and held it in her hand and looked at the needle. North. Always north. She thought about the phone call with Victor Kane, the specific quality of silence between his answers, the kind of silence that wasn't emptiness, but wait. She had not spoken to anyone on that level for 4 years. She had not allowed herself to. She thought about what he had said. Is that sustainable? She had heard the question the way it was meant, not as an attack, not as manipulation, as the question of a person who had been in this long enough to know what it cost. She closed her hand round the compass. She didn't have an answer to that question. She had never let herself sit with it long enough to develop one. Maybe that was an answer in itself. She stood up. She checked her forearm. The field dressing was holding. It could wait another 18 hours. She shouldered her pack. She looked at the empty valley below her. 11 men, alive. She turned north and started walking. She was 300 meters into her extraction route when she heard a sound from behind her that stopped her completely. Not a dangerous sound, not a sound that meant threat, a sound she hadn't expected. She turned slowly. On the rock where she had been sitting, someone had placed something while she was watching the helicopter leave. She had not heard them approach. She had not detected any movement. She went back to the rock. On it was a small folded piece of paper held down by a stone. She unfolded it. It said, "For the you existed here, and 11 men are flying home because of it. If you ever decide the next one shouldn't be alone, there's a chair at a table you haven't been invited to yet. The invitation is standing. No conditions. No compromise on your methods. Just back up if you want it." At the bottom, a phone number. She read it twice. She stood in the empty valley with the note in her hand and the compass in her pocket and the cold working its way back through her jacket, and she felt something happen in her chest that she recognized distantly as the sensation of a wall developing a crack. Not collapsing, just a crack. She looked at the phone number for a long time. Then she folded the note very carefully and put it in her breast pocket next to the field notebook, next to Daniel's handwriting, next to everything she carried that was irreplaceable. She turned north again. She started walking. And she did not know, could not know, that 3 kilometers behind her, Victor Kane was standing at the edge of the ridge watching her go, and that he was thinking about Daniel Reeves and about what it cost a person to be necessary in a world that couldn't acknowledge them, and about the chair at the table, and whether she would ever take it. He watched until she was gone. Then he looked at the empty landing zone where the helicopter had been. 11 men, alive, flying home. I thought about the word he had written on the map. Wait, he understood now that the word had not been an instruction for the blocking force. It had been, without knowing it, something he was saying to himself. Wait, for you make the choice that can't be undone. Wait and look at what you're really looking at. He had looked, he had seen. And what he had seen had changed the shape of what he thought this business was supposed to be. He walked back to the truck. The Montana morning was fully committed now. Cold and clear and enormous. The kind of sky that made you feel very small and very awake simultaneously. He had a phone call to make to his operational chain. He had no idea how to explain any of this. He got in the truck and sat for a moment. Then he pulled out his notebook and looked at what he had written. The program should not have died with Reeves. This needs to exist. Someone needs to make sure it continues. He looked at it for the long time. Then he pulled out his satellite phone. He didn't call his operational chain. He called a different number, a number that lived in a different part of his contacts in the section he rarely opened, labeled with a single letter. The phone rang twice. A voice answered. "Kane," it said, not a question. The voice of someone who had been waiting for this call for an unspecified amount of time. "I found Reeves's program," Victor said. Silence. "I found the person who's been running it," he said, "alone for 4 years. And I need to tell you that if we don't find a way to support what she's doing, we are wasting the most effective thing this organization has ever accidentally produced." Another silence. Longer. Then the voice said, "Send me everything." Victor started the truck. "I'll send you what I have," he said, "which isn't everything. Most of what she is can't be documented." He paused. "But I'll send you enough." He drove away from the valley with the Montana sky, enormous above him, and the empty landing zone in his mirror, getting smaller, and he thought about a woman walking north through the cold with a folded piece of paper in her breast pocket and a compass in her hip pocket, and 11 lives she would never be credited for in a direction she had chosen before anyone asked her to. He thought about whether she would call the number. He thought about the crack in the wall. He had seen it. She didn't know he had, but he had seen it. And in this business, a crack was the beginning of everything. The helicopter touched down at the forward operating base at 14:47 hours, and the moment the wheels made contact with the tarmac, Ryan Mitchell felt something leave his body that he hadn't fully realized he had been carrying. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief was too simple a word for it. It was more like the specific physical sensation of 11 days of sustained alertness, releasing its grip on his nervous system and all at once. The way a fist unclenches after holding something very heavy for so long that the unclenching itself becomes painful. He was the last one off the aircraft. The rest of the team was already on the tarmac, and there was a brief, wordless moment where nobody was moving and nobody was talking, and 11 men just stood in the cold air and breathed. Ryan had been part of enough extractions to know that this moment existed and to know that it was important, that it needed to be allowed. He let it run. Then Marcus said, "I want a burger, a real one, not whatever they serve in the mess." Torres laughed, and the sound of it broke the spell, and 11 men started moving toward the debrief building with the loose-limbed relief of people returning from somewhere they weren't certain they'd return from. Ryan walked behind them and watched them and thought about the thermal signature on Ethan's sensor screen. 0148 to 0156 hours. 8 minutes, standing in the dark, watching them sleep. I thought about the empty ridge lines at the choke point, the shape of prepared ground, the particular silence of a corridor that had been cleared. I thought about all of it, and he carried it inside, and he sat through 3 hours of debrief with the kind of patience that was not natural to him, but that he had learned because the mission required it, and he answered every question accurately and completely, and said nothing about the sensor data, or the thermal signature, or the pattern Ethan had shown him on the overlay map. After the debrief, when the team had dispersed to showers and phones and the specific rituals of men reconnecting with the lives that existed outside the mission, Ryan went back to the tarmac alone. He stood where the helicopter had landed. He looked at the mountains on the horizon, the same mountains they had been inside for 11 days. From here, they looked still and indifferent, the way mountains always looked from a distance. You couldn't see what lived in them. You couldn't see what moved through them. He thought about what Ethan had said. Someone protected us. He thought about it for a long time. Then he did something he rarely did in public spaces. He spoke out loud to no one visible. "I don't know if you can hear this," he said quietly, just above the ambient sound of the bass. "I don't know if you're still out there or if you're already gone. I don't know who you are." He paused. "But 11 people got on that helicopter today. 11 people have someone waiting for them. And I know in the way you know things that the data confirms that not all of us would have made it without you." The wind moved, nothing else. He looked at the mountains. "You're not invisible to everyone," he said. "I see you. I don't know your face. I don't know your name. But I see what you did." Another pause. "And someone should say thank you, so I'm saying it. Thank you." He stood there for another minute. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the small tactical compass he carried on every mission standard issue. Nothing remarkable about it, except that he had carried it on 43 missions and it had always pointed north. And he walked to the edge of the tarmac and set it on a low concrete post where the perimeter met the open ground. He stepped back. He looked at it. It was a small thing, a gesture that made no operational sense, and that he would never include in any report. He turned and walked back toward the base. He didn't know if anyone would find it. He didn't know if anyone was watching. But the doing of it was its own completion. 240 kilometers to the south, Maya was in a motel room that she had paid for in cash under a name that didn't exist, sitting on the edge of the bed, with her left forearm on the table in front of her, and a medical kit open beside it, doing the kind of field repair on herself that she had been trained to do, and that she had done enough times that the process was more mechanical than painful. The wound was a graze, deep enough to bleed significantly, shallow enough that it hadn't compromised anything structural. It needed cleaning, closure, antibiotics, and time. She had the first three. Time was a negotiation. She worked methodically. She did not think about the pain, which was a technique and not a denial. She thought about the note in her breast pocket. She had read it 4 times since finding it on the rock. Each time she had folded it back precisely along the original fold lines and returned it to the same pocket. She was aware that this was not normal behavior for intelligence documentation, that field notes were assessed for content and then either retained or destroyed based on operational security requirements. She was aware that she was treating this piece of paper differently than she would treat any other piece of paper she had ever handled in the field. She was aware of this, and she continued doing it anyway. The invitation is standing. No conditions, no compromise on your methods. She finished with the wound and wrapped it properly and flexed her left hand twice to confirm circulation. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling. Backup if you want it. She thought about what that word meant. Backup. She had not had backup in 6 years. She had not wanted it, which was the thing she needed to be honest with herself about. It wasn't that backup had been unavailable or impractical. It was that she had organized her entire operational life around its absence. She had built a system, an identity, a sense of purpose that was specifically predicated on doing this alone. Because doing it alone meant the only decisions were hers. The only risks were hers, the only failures were hers, and the only costs were hers. She had never let herself fully name the thing that drove that choice. She named it now sitting alone in a motel room 240 kilometers from the mountains where 11 men had gotten on a helicopter that afternoon. It was grief. Not grief for Daniel specifically, though that was part of it, but grief for the version of the work that had existed when Daniel was alive, the version where she had been part of something larger than herself, where the mission had been shared, where the cost of failure had been distributed across more than one person. When Daniel died, she had not replaced what she had lost with something else. She had replaced it with more work, more missions, more 11-man units who needed someone in the hills above them. And the work had been real, and the outcomes had been real, and she believed in every single one of them. But she had also somewhere in the last 4 years stopped asking herself whether this was a sustainable way to be alive. Victor Kane had asked her. She had deflected. She had said Daniel thought it was, which was true, but was not an answer to the question she had been asked. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she sat up and pulled out her field notebook and opened it to the last page with writing on it. The page where she had written on day 8 of the Montana operation, "He thinks like me." She turned to the next blank page. She wrote the date and the time. Then she wrote a single question. What would Daniel say about the note? She held the pen above the paper. She knew what Daniel would say. She had known Daniel for 4 years, and she had internalized his voice so completely that she could predict his response to almost any situation with the accuracy of someone who had been paying very close attention to a teacher they loved. He would say, assess the asset, analyze the offer, determine whether it serves the mission. She wrote that down. Then she wrote underneath it, does it serve the mission? She thought about it. Objectively, without the emotional complexity, the answer was probably yes. A resource that provided backup without compromising operational independence would increase her effectiveness in high-risk scenarios. The Montana operation had required more from her than any single operation she had run in 4 years. The wound on her arm was a data point. If she had been further into the operation, more fatigued with a larger force against her, that wound would have been in a worse location. She wrote yes, probably. Then she wrote underneath the question she was actually trying to get to. Do I want it? She held the pen above that line for a while. Then she closed the notebook. She wasn't ready to answer that yet, but she had asked it, which was further than she had been before. She put the notebook back in her pack and lay down on the bed without removing her boots, which was a habit she had developed early in her training and never fully broken. And she looked at the ceiling and thought about what came next, the next mission. There was always a next mission, but tonight, for the first time in 4 years, the next mission was not the first thing she thought about. The first thing she thought about was the crack in the wall. She felt it. She didn't understand it yet, but she felt it. She closed her eyes. At 1600 hours, 600 kilometers east of the motel room, Ryan Mitchell was sitting in the base communications room with his personal phone in his hand and the door closed, which was the physical signal that meant he needed 5 minutes without anyone needing anything from him. He had called his wife, Sarah, who had answered on the second ring the way she always answered when he was in the field, and she had been tracking the expected return window. She had not said, I was worried. She had said, are you okay, in the specific tone that meant she was asking, not about injuries, but about the version of him that came back from places like this. the version that sometimes took days to fully reconnect with the man she had married. He had said, "I'm okay, everyone's okay." She had exhaled, and the sound of it had traveled 600 kilometers and arrived in his chest like a physical thing. They had talked for 12 minutes. He had not told her about the sensor data or the thermal signature. He would tell her eventually in the way he told her things that had no operational classification and that he needed to say out loud to someone who knew him outside the uniform. But not yet. After he hung up, he sat in the quiet of the communications room and thought about the compass he had left on the concrete post. He thought about who might find it. He thought about what they would think. I thought about the fact that someone had chosen repeatedly and at significant personal cost to be present in the worst possible conditions for the sole purpose of keeping people alive, who would never know they were being kept alive, and that this person had done it without a net, without backup, without anyone to call when things went wrong. He thought about what kind of strength that required, not just tactical strength, personal strength, the kind that had to come from somewhere specific, from a decision that had been made so deeply it had become structural part of the foundation. He thought about what that decision might have cost. He was still thinking about it when Ethan knocked and came in. "I need to show you something," Ethan said. His voice had the particular quality that Ryan associated with things that were going to require careful judgment about what to do next. Ryan had put his phone away. "Show me." Ethan set his tablet on the table between them. On the screen was a composite image, a thermal overlay of the last 48 hours of sensor data from their camp and the surrounding terrain. He had clearly spent the last 2 hours processing it. "I went back further," Ethan said, "past what I showed you this morning. I pulled everything the passive system recorded from the moment I activated it. And 11 days," Ethan said. 37 separate movement events logged in the sensor data, all of them in the terrain surrounding our position. None of them ever closer than 30 meters to the perimeter, except for 2. And those 2 are the ones at 0148 and 031 hours on day 11. Ryan looked at the screen. 37, he said. 37, and when I overlay the timing of those movement events against our mission log, against every instance where we documented enemy contact, attempted contact, or suspicious activity, the correlation is 100%. Ryan looked up. "Every time something should have happened to us and didn't," Ethan said. "There was a movement event in the terrain within 4 hours of the non-event." The room was very quiet. "What do I do with this?" Ethan asked. It was a genuine question asked without agenda. He was looking at Ryan with the expression of a man who had found an answer and wasn't sure whether the answer was something the world was ready for. Ryan looked at the thermal composite. 37 movement events. 37 times in 11 days that someone had been out there. In the cold, alone, moving through hostile terrain in the dark, in the early morning, and the middle of the day, staying out of sight, staying out of the story, making the story go differently than it would have gone without them. He thought about the compass on the concrete post. "File the mission data," he said. "The enemy failures as observed. The tactical anomalies as observed. Don't include the sensor analysis." "Ryan, I'm not asking you to omit it because it's damaging," Ryan said. "I'm asking you to omit it because it's private." Ethan was quiet. "Private," he repeated. "Someone has been doing something in this world that they haven't asked to be known for," Ryan said. "The data you're holding is essentially their name, and they didn't give us permission to say it." He paused. "They gave us something else." Ethan looked at the tablet. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the case. "Okay," he said. "Thank you, Ethan." Ethan stood up to leave. He got to the door. Then he stopped. Without turning around, he said, "I hope they know it worked." He left. Ryan sat alone in the communications room. "I hope they do too," he said to the empty room. He meant it. 3 days after the extraction, the SEAL team received their mission commendations in a ceremony that was modest by design and significant by outcome. The commanding general said the things that commanding generals say about professionalism and execution, and the credit that accrues to training and preparation and the American fighting spirit, and Ryan stood at attention and thought about 37 movement events in 11 days and said nothing. Marcus was standing next to him, and at one point during the second speech, leaned approximately 1 centimeter in Ryan's direction and said very quietly from the corner of his mouth, "You're doing the thinking face." "I don't have a thinking face," Ryan said, equally quiet. "You have had a thinking face since 1103 hours on extraction day when we came through the choke point and you looked up at the ridgeline and made the thinking face. I was assessing the tactical situation. You were thinking about whoever cleared it, Marcus said. Ryan said nothing. So was I, Marcus said. The general continued speaking. Ryan looked straight ahead and thought about the compass on the post and whether it was still there and whether it had been found. He had gone back to check before leaving the base. The compass was gone. He didn't know whether that meant she had found it, but someone had taken it, and he had decided to believe it was her. 400 kilometers away, in a different motel room, in a different state, Maya was looking at a small tactical compass she had found on a concrete post at the edge of a military tarmac. She had driven past the base for a different reason. She had been transiting to a contact point further east, and the road had taken her near the base, and she had pulled over for a reason she didn't fully examine in the moment. She had walked to the perimeter, staying well outside the active security boundary, and she had found the post with the compass on it almost immediately. She had known in the way you know things that your training confirms that it had been placed recently. The metal was cold, but the positioning was deliberate, balanced on the post with the care of something intentionally left rather than accidentally dropped. She had stood there for a moment, then she had picked it up. She turned it over now in her right hand. On the back, someone had scratched words into the metal with something small and sharp. Not deep, not professional. The scratches of a person who had decided to say something after the fact, improvising the method. The words said, "Those who protect others are never truly forgotten." She read it twice. Then she held the compass in both hands the way she held Daniel's compass when she needed to think, and she felt the crack in the wall become something slightly larger, not a door, not yet, but larger. She thought about what it meant that someone had done this. Ryan Mitchell, because she was certain it was him, had stood on a tarmac and talked to empty air and left a compass on a post. He had done it knowing she might not find it, knowing she might already be gone, knowing there was no mechanism by which this gesture would ever be reported or recognized or folded into any narrative about the mission. He had done it anyway, because it was true, because the truth deserved to be said even when no one verifiably heard it. She thought about Daniel. She thought about what he had said very late in his life after an operation that had gone worse than either of them had wanted. He had said with the particular tiredness of a man who had been carrying weight for a long time. The thing about this work is that you have to make your peace with the fact that it doesn't accumulate. Every time is the first time. Every unit is a clean slate. You don't get to carry credit forward. You just carry the mission. She had understood what he meant. She understood it differently now. He had been right that the credit didn't accumulate, but he had been wrong or incomplete about what did. The people accumulated, not in any official sense, not in a way that could be documented or quantified. But Ryan Mitchell existed, and Marcus Webb existed, and Tourism Park, and Ethan, and 7 other men existed in a way they would not have without the 11 days she had spent in the mountains. They existed and they were accumulating. Not for her. She wasn't collecting them, wasn't building a ledger of lives protected. That wasn't the point. But she carried them, she realized. She had always carried them, she just hadn't named it. Every unit she had ever run, protection for every mission she had ever run, silent support on every person who had gotten on a helicopter that she had helped make possible. She carried them in the same way she carried Daniel, as a weight that was not a burden, but a ballast. The thing that kept you from drifting. She looked at the compass, both of them. Daniel's in her left hand, Ryan's in her right. She sat with that for a moment. Then she made a decision. She put Ryan's compass in her left breast pocket next to the field notebook next to Daniel's handwriting. She put Daniel's compass back in her right hip pocket where it lived. She had not put anything in her breast pocket before. That pocket had been Daniel's space, the notebook, and the small references she carried that connected to him. She made room. She was aware that this was a significant thing in the private language she had built around her own survival. She sat with the significance for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone. She looked at the number Victor Kane had written on the note. She had been looking at it for 3 days. She dialed it. It rang once. Victor answered. "I thought you might call," he said. "Don't make a thing of it," she said. She heard something in his exhale that might have been a laugh. "The chair is still there," he said. "I heard you the first time. I know, I just wanted to confirm the logistics haven't changed. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the motel window, the world was doing its ordinary things. Traffic, a dog barking somewhere, the distant sound of an aircraft that was entirely civilian and presented no threat. I'm not coming in, she said. That's not what this is. I know, Victor said. I'm not changing how I operate. I know. I'm not reporting to anyone. I'm not on a schedule. I'm not accessible on demand. I know. Then what exactly, she said, is the offer? Victor was quiet for a moment. You call when you need something, he said. Intel extraction, support medical, whatever the mission requires that you can't source alone. And I provide it off record, no strings. No one knows about you except me. And what do you get? It wasn't a question about payment. She was asking about the real currency. He seemed to understand that. I get to know someone like you exists in the world, he said, and I get to not have to explain why I think that matters. She looked at the compass in her breast pocket. You told someone about me, she said. After Montana, you made a call. A pause. Yes. Who? Someone who can provide resources without requiring accountability, Victor said carefully. Someone who has the clearance to understand what the program was and what it should be. And what did they say? They said, send me everything. Maya processed that. What did you send? Operational summary, pattern analysis, no personal identification beyond your designation. He paused. And my assessment, which was, he said it without hesitation, that the program should not have died with Daniel, and that you are the reason it didn't. The silence that followed was the longest one in any conversation she had ever had with anyone. She breathed. She thought about Daniel. She thought about what he would say if he could hear this conversation. She went through the possibilities the way she went through tactical options, systematically eliminating the ones that didn't fit what she knew of him. He would not say take the support. Daniel had run his own version of this alone for a long time before she arrived and had never asked for institutional backing from anyone who could also demand institutional accountability. But he would not say refuse it either. He would say, assess the mission, determine what serves the outcome, not what serves you, not what protects your identity, what serves the people who need protecting. She heard his voice say it, flat and direct and utterly without sentiment. And then quieter in a register she had heard rarely and remembered exactly. You're allowed to not do this alone, Maya. I was wrong about that. I want you to know I was wrong about that. He had never said those words to her. He had never had the chance, but she heard them now, and they were as real as anything that she had written in the field notebook that lived in her breast pocket. She looked at the ceiling. Okay, she said. Victor said nothing for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay, the offer stands and I understand the parameters, and I reserve the right to never use it. Of course. But it stands. Yes, Victor said. She heard in his voice the same thing she had heard when he said he believed her about the 11 minutes. The recognition of something real. There's a situation developing in Eastern Europe, he said. Civilian protection operation, high-risk small unit. I have some preliminary intelligence that suggests. Not tonight, she said. Right, of course. Send me the file tomorrow. Another pause. You'll have it by Borough 600, he said. She ended the call. She sat in the motel room with 2 compasses and a field notebook and a phone number she had just used for the first time, and she breathed steadily, 4 counts in, 6 counts out. She thought about Ryan Mitchell standing on the tarmac talking to empty air. Those who protect others are never truly forgotten. She touched the breast pocket. Then she lay back and looked at the ceiling and let the ordinary sounds of the world outside the window exist without cataloging them. She would catalog them again tomorrow. Tonight she let them be noise. She thought about what had changed. In the 11 days of the Montana operation, she had been closer to being seen than at any point in 6 years. She had been hunted by someone who was genuinely good. She had been wounded. She had been forced to communicate with another human being in a direct and unmediated way that she had not done since Daniel died. She had found a compass on a post that said she was not forgotten, and she had called a phone number. These were not small things. She rolled them over in her mind and tried to determine which of them had cracked the wall. She thought it was the 8 minutes, not her own 8 minutes of watching from the ridge while the helicopter lifted. Not the phone calls or the notes or the tactical decisions. The 8 minutes Ryan Mitchell had stood on the perimeter of his camp in the dark and looked up at the ridgelines, looking for something he couldn't name. She had been there. She had been watching him look. And in those 8 minutes, without knowing she was doing it, she had allowed herself to be looked for. Not found, but looked for, and it had mattered. She held that thought. It had mattered. She fell asleep in her boots in a motel room, in a state she wouldn't remember caring about, with two compasses in two different pockets, in the particular kind of rest that comes not from safety, because she was never entirely safe, but from something adjacent to it. Something that felt, if she was honest, like the beginning of a different kind of carrying, not alone, not entirely. At 200 hours that night, 600 kilometers north, Ryan Mitchell was sitting at the kitchen table of his house, the house with the yellow light in the window that Sarah always left on when he was deployed. Sarah had gone to bed an hour ago. He had told her he'd be up soon, and he had meant it, and then he had sat down with a glass of water and not moved for 40 minutes. He was writing something. I wasn't a writer by nature. He kept operational notes and mission logs and the professional documentation required by his rank, but he had not written anything personal in years. He had started a dozen times in the early years of his career and always found that the things that most needed to be said were the ones most resistant to the process. But tonight he was writing. I was writing about 11 days in Montana, about a thermal signature, about a choke point that had been cleared by hands he would never shake, about the specific quality of 37 movement events in a passive sensor log, each one representing a choice made in the cold and the dark by a person who had never asked anyone to know about it. He was not writing it for any official purpose. He was writing it because Ethan had said he hoped they knew it worked, and Ryan had realized, sitting in the communications room, that knowing was not the same as remembering, and that some things needed to be written down, not so that the world could see them, but so that they could exist outside the person carrying them. He wrote for 40 minutes. I was not a polished writer. He wrote the way he thought, which was direct and sequential and occasionally repeated itself when the thought came around twice. But he wrote it all. The ambush on day 4, the choke point, the compass on the concrete post, the conversation on the tarmac that no one had heard. At the end, he wrote one paragraph that he read twice and did not change. He wrote, somewhere out there, someone is on the next one. Someone is in another set of mountains or another desert or another corridor of terrain that has been prepared to kill people, and they are doing the same thing they have always done. Moving quietly, protecting people who don't know they need protecting, carrying a weight they chose and carrying it alone. I don't know your name, I don't know your face, but I know you're real, and I know the work is real. And I know that 11 families have someone coming home because you were there. That's not nothing. That's not invisible. That's the whole point. He closed the notebook. He sat with the quiet for a moment. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs to where Sarah was sleeping. He got into bed carefully, trying not to wake her. She said without opening her eyes, "You okay?" "Yeah," he said. "You sure to?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm sure." She was quiet. Then she reached over and put her hand on his arm in the way she had been doing for 11 years. The simple, grounded, entirely sufficient gesture of a person who was present. He put his hand over hers. Outside the window, the world was ordinary and enormous and full of people who had no idea what moved through it on their behalf. Ryan closed his eyes. He thought about the compass, gone from the post, taken. He decided again, as he had decided at the base, to believe it was her. And in believing it, he let himself be glad. He let himself feel the specific, quiet, enormous gladness of a man who had sent a message into the dark and chosen to believe it arrived. He fell asleep. And far away in a different time zone, in a different kind of dark, a woman slept in her boots, with 2 compasses in 2 pockets and a phone number and recent calls for the first time in 6 years. Neither of them knew the other was asleep, but they were both, for the first time in a long time, resting. The file Victor sent arrived at exactly 0600 hours as promised. Maya was already awake. She had been awake since 0430, not from insomnia, but from the particular biological clock of someone whose body had learned that the hours before dawn were the hours when the world was most honest. She had been sitting with her field notebook open and a cup of bad motel coffee going cold beside her, reading back through the entries from the Montana operation with the specific intention of extracting what she had learned rather than what she had felt. She kept what she had felt separate. She was still learning how to do that less completely. The file came through on the encrypted channel Victor had established during their call. She opened it and read it in 14 minutes, which was longer than she usually took on a preliminary intelligence package, but shorter than the material probably warranted. It was a complex situation, Eastern European border region, a small protective detail for a civilian documentation team operating in an area where three different armed factions had overlapping and competing interests in ensuring the documentation never happened. The civilian team was 4 people. Journalists technically, though, their actual function was closer to human rights investigation. They had institutional backing, but no security infrastructure. They had a local fixer who knew the terrain and no idea how exposed they were. She read the threat assessment twice. Then she called Victor. He answered before the second ring. "You read it fast," he said. "The fixer is compromised," she said. Paragraph 9, the movement pattern for the team's second day of operations. Someone with advanced knowledge of their route placed that checkpoint. The fixer is the only person who knew the route 2 days ahead. Silence. "I didn't catch that," Victor said. "I know. That's why I'm telling you." She paused. "The team needs to be notified without the fixer knowing they've been notified. And they need an alternative route for day 3 that bypasses the checkpoint entirely. Can you get that to them?" "I can get to them," she said, which was a different and more complete answer. She heard Victor process the distinction. "The timeline is tight," he said. "They move on day 3 in approximately 36 hours. "I know. Maya." He said her name with the particular weight of someone who had something to say that they weren't sure they had the right to say. "The wound on your arm." She stopped. "How do you know about the wound?" "I have eyes in the field, not on you specifically, but I saw the field dressing material in the position you left." A pause. "I'm asking if you're operationally ready." She looked at her forearm. The dressing was clean. The inflammation had reduced. It was functioning. "Yes," she said. "If you need Victor." "Right," he said. "Okay." She ended the call and started packing. 22 hours later, she was on a commercial flight with a passport that identified her as a Canadian environmental researcher, which was a cover identity she had built over 18 months for exactly this category of operational environment. She had a laptop bag, a carry-on, and the same field kit she always carried in a configuration that cleared security in any of 14 countries without triggering secondary inspection. She thought about the civilian documentation team for most of the flight. 4 people, no training, doing work that was genuinely important and genuinely dangerous, and doing it with the particular courage of people who understood the danger intellectually, but hadn't yet felt it as a physical reality. That was the gap she was going to close before they did. She thought about the fixer. A compromised fixer was one of the most dangerous variables in this kind of operation, more dangerous in some ways than a hostile armed unit, because the threat was intimate, entrusted, and invisible in exactly the wrong way. She'd need to manage the fixer without triggering whatever reporting chain existed between him and the faction that had placed the checkpoint. She thought about how she would do it. By the time the aircraft landed, she had a plan. She also had a text message from a number she didn't recognize, which was unusual enough that she didn't dismiss it as misdial. She read it twice in the arrivals terminal. The message said, "Captain Mitchell left something for you. Base perimeter East Post." "It's still there." She stopped walking. People moved around her in the current of an arriving international flight, pulling luggage, consulting phones, navigating toward the exit, with the determination of people who had places to be. She stood still. The message had no signature. The number, when she ran it through the mental index she maintained, of all contacts, direct and indirect, that she had ever used, registered against exactly one partial match. A number that Ethan Brooks had used to pass a tactical update through an intermediary channel during an operation 3 years ago that she had run silent support on. Ethan Brooks, the intelligence officer from the SEAL team. She looked at the message again. It's still there. She thought about Ryan Mitchell's voice in her imagination, the voice she had constructed from watching him on the ridge, from the compass, from the scratched words on the metal. She thought about what someone would leave at a base perimeter post after the extraction, after the debrief, after everything. She thought about it for 11 seconds. Then she booked a connecting flight. The deviation would cost her 9 hours. In a 36-hour window, 9 hours was not nothing, but she had run the math on the Eastern European operation, and she had margin. Tight margin, but margin. She landed at the domestic airport nearest the base at 2140 hours and rented a car and drove to the perimeter road that ran along the east side of the installation. She parked half a kilometer away and walked the rest in the dark, which was unnecessary from a security standpoint, but which she did from habit and from the particular quality of alertness that walking in darkness gave her. She found the East Post. On it was a small package wrapped in waterproof material and tape securely tucked into the gap between the post and the chain link fence in a way that was sheltered from weather but visible to someone who was looking. She opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a photograph. She looked at the photograph first. It was a group photograph, 11 men in uniform taken on a tarmac. Candid rather than posed, the kind of photograph that gets taken after something significant because someone feels compelled to document the fact that everyone is present and accounted for. She could identify Ryan at the right edge of the group by his height and posture and the particular way he was standing slightly apart from the others, not distant but observant. The way a person stands when they are present and also watching. She looked at each face. Marcus Webb she recognized from the left flank. Torres near the center laughing at something. Park with his hand in his jacket pocket where the journal lived. 11 faces, all of them alive. She held the photograph for a long time. Then she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was Ryan's. She knew this without having seen it before, in the same way she knew things that her training confirmed, because the handwriting had the same quality as the scratch words on the compass, direct and purposeful, and slightly rough at the edges. The letter was 2 pages. She read it in the rental car with the interior light on which she never did, and which she did not think about until she was finished reading. He had written about the 11 days. He had written about the choke point. He had written about what Ethan's sensor analysis showed 37 movement events, and he had written it in a way that told her he had understood exactly what those events meant and had chosen to protect that information from any official record. He had written about his wife Sarah and about the yellow light in the window. He had written near the end a paragraph that she read 3 times. He wrote, "I don't know what your life looks like outside of what you do. I don't know if you have people waiting for you the way Sarah waits for me. I hope you do. I hope there is somewhere you go when the mission is finished where someone has left the light on. And if there isn't, I want you to know that 11 people are carrying you with them into every ordinary day they get to live. You are in those days. You made those days possible. And the least I can do is say so. Even if I'm saying it to someone I'll never meet in a letter that might never be found." She stopped reading. She sat in the car in the dark parking area a half kilometer from the base perimeter with the interior light on and 2 pages of Ryan Mitchell's handwriting in her hands. She was not a person who cried easily or often. This was not a performance of toughness. It was simply the truth of how she was built by training and by the nature she had brought to the training, both of which had reinforced each other over the years into a temperament that processed emotion differently than most people. But her eyes were wet. She acknowledged this the way she acknowledged cold. Information. You acknowledged it, you let it be what it was, and then you kept going. She folded the letter very carefully along its original lines. She placed it in her breast pocket with the field notebook and the compass Ryan had left on the concrete post, in Daniel's handwriting, and everything else she carried that was irreplaceable. The pocket was getting full. She turned off the interior light. She sat in the dark for a moment. She thought about the photograph. 11 faces, all of them alive. All of them in the ordinary days Ryan had written about, the days she had made possible, the days they were living without knowing the full cost of what it had taken to make them available. She thought about what Daniel had said. The thing about this work is that it doesn't accumulate. She thought about the photograph in her breast pocket next to the letter, next to the compass, next to the notebook. She thought about 37 movement events. She thought about Victor Kane's voice on the phone saying the program should not have died with Daniel. She thought about the crack in the wall. She had been calling it a crack for 3 days, the thing that had begun in Montana and continued with the note on the rock, and the phone call, and the compass, and now this letter, this photograph. She understood now that it wasn't a crack. It was an opening she had been making deliberately in increments, small enough that she could manage each one without being overwhelmed by the sum. The wall had not developed a structural failure. She had been, without fully acknowledging it, choosing to open a door. She sat with that. Then she pulled out her phone and called Victor. He answered immediately, which told her he had been awake. I need to move the Eastern European operation up 6 hours, she said. I've lost time. I can have the alternate route package ready in 2 hours, he said. Make it 90 minutes. A pause. Are you all right? She thought about the letter in her pocket. I found what Mitchell left at the post, she said. Victor was quiet. He wrote a letter, she said. More quiet. He's a good man, Victor said. Yes, she said. He is. She started the car. 90 minutes, she said. You'll have it in 80. She drove toward the airport. She thought about 11 faces in a photograph. She thought about the yellow light in a window. She drove. At both 3:40 hours, Ryan Mitchell woke suddenly in a way that had nothing to do with threat assessment and everything to do with the particular instinct of a person who has left something in the world and is waiting without knowing they are waiting for some confirmation of its arrival. He lay still in the dark next to Sarah, who was sleeping with the reliable depth of someone who had done the hardest work of the night already, which was waiting for him to come home. He thought about the package at the East Post. He had put it there 4 days ago after a conversation with Ethan that had started as a routine debrief follow-up and had turned into something else entirely. Ethan had come to him with the photograph, the one the team's youngest operator had taken on the tarmac without telling anyone. He had printed a copy and brought it to Ryan with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was living with it. I thought you might want this, Ethan had said. Ryan had looked at the photograph for a long time. How did you know about the post, he had asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Ethan had said, very carefully, I didn't know about the post specifically. I knew you went back to check it the morning we shipped out, and I knew the compass was gone. He paused. I've been running passive signals monitoring on a low-power channel since we got back. Someone accessed a civilian communication network through a relay point approximately 40 kilometers from the base 3 days ago. The access pattern was consistent with someone checking a message. He stopped. I sent a message to the number 2 days ago. Ryan was very still. What did you say? I told them what you left was still there. Ryan looked at the photograph. And the relay point went active again 6 hours ago, Ethan said. Someone was within 40 kilometers of this base 6 hours ago. Ryan looked at the photograph in his hands. 11 faces, all alive. All ordinary in the extraordinary way of people who do not know they are in a photograph that exists because of someone else's choice. She was here, he said. She was here, Ethan said. Ryan had looked at the photograph for another long moment. Does anyone else know about the relay monitoring? No. Keep it that way. Ethan had nodded and left. Ryan had gone back to his office and sat for a long time. Now lying in the dark next to Sarah, he thought about what it meant that she had come. Not because she needed to, not because the mission required it, but because Ryan had left something for her and she had gone 8 hours out of her way to find it. She had read the letter. He didn't know if that was true with certainty, but he believed it. He believed it because the alternative was that someone had driven to the base perimeter and picked up a waterproof package in the dark and left, and that person was not curious enough to open it. And the person who had spent 11 days in the Montana mountains doing what she had done was not a person who lacked curiosity. She was a person who lacked the permission to be curious about herself. And maybe he thought that was changing. He hoped it was changing. He lay in the dark and hoped very specifically and clearly the way you hope for things when you understand that hope is not passive, but directed, aimed at something specific and held there. He hoped she had a yellow light somewhere. He hoped she was not entirely alone. He fell back asleep, and in a different time zone in the back of a car moving through an Eastern European city in the pre-dawn hours, Maya was looking at a photograph of 11 men on a tarmac. She had the photograph in her lap and her field notebook open beside it in the encrypted route package Victor had sent filling the other half of the seat. She was thinking about what came next, not just operationally, that part was clear. The civilian documentation team, the compromise fixer, the alternate route for day 3, the 36 hours that had become 27. She was thinking about what came next in the larger sense, the sense that Ryan's letter had made unavoidable. She had spent 6 years believing that invisibility was the cost of effectiveness, that being known was incompatible with being safe, that allowing anyone to see what she did and who she was would compromise everything that made the doing possible. Montana had not proven her wrong exactly, but it had shown her the edge of what that belief could hold. Victor had seen her, Ryan had seen the shape of her, Ethan had found the relay signal. And she was still here, still operational, still able to do the things she had come to Eastern Europe to do. Being seen had not destroyed her, it had in some way she was still mapping made her more complete. She looked at the photograph. She thought about Daniel. She thought about what he had never had the chance to say, and about the words she had heard anyway the night she held both compasses in both hands in the motel room. "You're allowed to not do this alone. I was wrong about that." She folded the photograph carefully and placed it in her breast pocket. The pocket was full now. Letter, photograph, 2 compasses, field notebook. Full of things that had been given to her, full of people who had seen enough of her to want to give her something. She looked out the window at a city moving through its early hours, the particular motion of a place before it wakes completely, when the streets belong to the people who do the work that makes the ordinary day possible. She thought about yellow lights in windows. She did not have a yellow light. She did not have a Sarah. She did not have 11 years of the particular knowledge of being known by one specific person in the way Ryan had described it, hand on arm, present and grounded and sufficient. She did not have that. But she had the photograph and the letter and the compass with the scratch words and Victor's number in recent calls. And she had the 27 hours in front of her and the 4 people in a documentation team who were going to get home because she was here and the next operation after that and the next. She had the accumulation. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. Maybe Daniel had been wrong about what accumulated and she had needed 6 years and 11 men and 2 ghosts in a Montana valley to understand that. She opened the route package and went to work. 3 days later, the civilian documentation team landed safely at their home airport, having completed their investigation and not having the language for why the last 3 days had felt in some atmospheric and non-specific way protected. Their fixer had been quietly sidelined from the operation through a sequence of events that each seemed individually plausible and collectively had redirected him entirely. The checkpoint on day 3's original route had been empty when an unrelated vehicle passed through it because the people who had placed it had received information that the documentation team had changed their schedule, which was not true but which had been introduced into their communication network by someone with a very specific understanding of how to make false information feel real. The 4-person team sat in the arrivals terminal and shook hands, and one of them cried, which she was embarrassed about, and which the others immediately and firmly told her was not embarrassing. And they all agreed to have dinner soon and knew that they would, and that the dinner would be loud and would last too long and would matter enormously. None of them knew they had been protected. None of them had any reason to know. But they were alive, and their documentation was intact, and the work they had done was going to matter in ways that would take years to fully measure, and somewhere in the operational silence that surrounded all of it, a woman who did not appear in any of their notes or records had made a series of choices that made all of it possible. She was already on the next one. 6 weeks after Montana, Ryan Mitchell was in his office on base going through the routine of a man who has returned to the ordinary machinery of his work when he found in the bottom drawer of his desk the notebook he had written in that night at the kitchen table. He had forgotten it was there. He opened it to the entry from that night. He read the last paragraph. He had written, "That's not nothing. That's not invisible. That's the whole point." He read it twice. Then he closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer because some things were not for the official record, and he had made his peace with that, and it was a peace that held. He went back to work. And in a different country, in a different operational environment. Maya was lying flat on a ridge in the kind of cold that reminded her of Montana, watching a small convoy move through a valley below her, running the math on the timing and the approach angles and the threat vector from the secondary position she had identified at 0340 hours. And she was doing all of this with the field notebook in her breast pocket and 2 compasses and a photograph of 11 men and a letter from a captain she would never meet. She was doing it alone, but she was carrying more than she had been. And the carrying felt different now, not lighter. The weight was the same, but the shape of it had changed the way the shape of a carried thing changes when you shift from holding it at arm's length to holding it against your body. Closer, more sustainable, less likely to fall. She raised her spotting scope. Below her, the convoy moved. She watched it, She began to work. At 0800 hours, back in the United States, in a city that was waking up to an ordinary day, Marcus Webb was making breakfast and thinking about nothing in particular when he thought about Montana, which happened sometimes the way things that were significant but unresolved floated up when the mind was not otherwise occupied. He thought about the choke point. He thought about looking up at the ridge line as they came through and seeing nothing there. I thought about what Ryan had said afterward when Marcus had pushed. She was protecting us. He stood at the kitchen counter and thought about that and about what it meant that someone had been up on that ridgeline doing something difficult and necessary and invisible for 11 days. He thought about the kind of person who made that choice. He thought about whether they were okay. He had no way to know. He had no way to check. He stood at the kitchen counter and felt the helplessness of that, the particular helplessness of a person who is good at solving problems and has found one he cannot solve, and then he let it go. The way you let go of things you cannot carry usefully, not because they don't matter, but because carrying them unproductively is its own kind of waste. He made his breakfast. He thought, I hope you're okay, whoever you are. He meant it the way Ryan had meant the thank you on the tarmac, as a thing that was true regardless of whether it arrived. He ate breakfast. He went to work. And on the other side of the world, Maya felt nothing of this because there was no mechanism by which she could, and because she was focused entirely on the convoy below her and the work that needed doing. But the thought existed. And thoughts, Daniel had once told her in one of his rarer and more philosophical moments, do not require a receiver to be real. The act of thinking them is itself a form of presence. She had not understood that at 22. She understood it now. She breathed. 4 counts and 6 counts out. The convoy reached the position she had cleared at 0340 hours. It passed through without incident. She watched it go. Then she began packing her kit for the next position, the next overwatch, the next 8 hours of the things she did that nobody would ever see. She pulled out the field notebook to make an entry. She opened it to the current page. At the top, she wrote the date and time and coordinates in her small, precise handwriting. Then she paused. She thought about what to write. She thought about Ryan's letter, about the yellow light, about the ordinary days. She thought about the photograph in her pocket. She thought about Daniel. She wrote 11 men got home. 4 civilians got home. This is why. She looked at that line. Then she wrote one more thing below it smaller. She wrote, I existed here. She closed the notebook. She put it back in her pocket. She picked up her spotting scope and looked at the valley below. The convoy was gone. The valley was empty. The morning was doing what mornings did, which was arrive without asking whether anyone was ready. She was ready. She was always ready. But she was ready differently now in a way that was harder to name than readiness and more durable than resolve. She was ready in the way of someone who has decided without ceremony or announcement that the work and the living of it are not separate things. That being present in the mission does not require being absent from everything else. That you can carry a photograph and a letter and 2 compasses and still be exactly who the work needs you to be. Maybe more so, she started moving. Still unseen, still carrying the mission, still the invisible woman in the invisible space between other people's survival and the danger that wanted to find them. But not invisible to herself, not anymore. And not entirely invisible to the 11 men who woke up every morning and made coffee and drove to work and called their mothers and argued with their partners and laughed too loud at bad jokes and lived fully and without special awareness of what it had taken to make that living available. They did not know her name, but they carried her with them into every ordinary day, and she carried them. And that was the legacy that would never be written in any official record, and that was more real than any record. And that was as Ryan Mitchell had written in a notebook by a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, not nothing.